So to actually get that direct testimony, it's such a great pleasure to have Eva with us. I think we've sorted out our projector problems. I hope you can see that. And I'm just going to hand over, as I say, it's a very, very pleasure. Please give a big round of applause to Eva Bartlett.
Thanks very much, and first of all, I'm going to be sitting, so I mean no offense, but I need to be at the helm of the computer. Thank you both for such an amazing introduction. You basically cut my speech in half. I don't need to go through the basics of how to enact regime change, because Joti very well and succinctly laid it out. And everything that you said about Libya applies to Syria. The vilification, the demonization, sanctions, of course. So I can skip quite a bit of that, and also things that Ranjit said. We know with Syria that the myths that prevailed for the first year or so was that the dictator is killing his people. There were innocent people in uprising, in nonviolent protests. The opposition was unarmed, the opposition, that it was a popular revolution. And many people indeed, even Syrians themselves that I know in, for example, Canada or America, and in Syria even, were misled because there was a will for political change in Syria. And no one is saying Syria was perfect. However, Syria was good in many regards. Wherever I've traveled in Syria, when I meet people, they told me, we wanted to go back to how it was. Syria was one of the safest countries. Women did not worry. I've had so many women tell me, we didn't worry to travel from Aleppo to Damascus at 2 a.m. with gold bracelets and jewelry on our arms and on our bodies because Syria was that safe. Of course, they have free education and healthcare like Libya. And so it wasn't a perfect society, and they did want reforms, and they actually got many of the reforms. But the initial protesters were not calling for reforms. They were calling for Alawis to be slaughtered and Christians to be driven out of Syria. And they weren't calling for democratic change. The initial protesters, not to say all of them were like this, but the predominant ones, whether in Dara or Homs, were calling for these things. And you can find many of these videos on YouTube. And I've had so many Syrians tell me this. I had a Syrian in Homs who is actually Alawi, but his name is a Sunni name. And he lived in an area that was predominantly Sunni, and this area of Homs happened to be infected with the Muslim Brotherhood virus, and they wanted to kill and slaughter Alawis. And it was only because he was raised in the area, but they thought he was Sunni, because that's one thing about Syrians in general, they didn't talk about their own particular faith so much. It's a very secular society. He said that was the only reason he wasn't slaughtered, was because they thought he was Sunni. On the other hand, you have the city of Aleppo, which is predominantly Sunni, and they didn't fall for the revolution. In fact, it came to them unwillingly in mid-2012. They rejected it, and I met with Sunni leaders in Aleppo, who happened to be from the east of Aleppo, and they said when terrorists invaded their areas, they demanded, why on Fridays are you not having protests coming from your mosques? And they said, we don't want any part of this. And for that, they had to flee because they were put on hit lists. So this isn't to say all of Sunnis in Syria, of course, are with this, but there are some, not many, that are influenced by the Saudis, by the Qataris, by the Turk, by Erdogan. And unfortunately, these terrorists largely from outside of Syria have come in, and you know the story, what they've done to Syria. But so the myth, in any case, the myth that this is all popular uprising and a will for political change, yes, the will for political change, but no, the popular uprising. In fact, I often refer to an article by Stephen Gowans, who's a Canadian writer, and he wrote sometime last year, I believe it was, The Revolutionary Distemper That Wasn't. And what's interesting about that article, in addition to the historical context he provides, going back decades regarding what happened in Syria, for example, in the 80s and prior, he actually cites some corporate media reports which surprisingly say in February, prior to the March protest, the reporters that were there in Syria were saying there isn't a will for revolution. The so-called Arab Spring, not that I buy into the Arab Spring, but anyway, the Arab Spring hadn't reached Syria. Which is interesting because later you would have outlets like Al Jazeera and then New York Times and other outlets insisting that there was revolution and that Assad was killing his people. Now, as an aside, and this is an anecdote, and you can take it for what it is, but I met a soldier who was in his early 20s, and he was in Damascus, and in March 2011, he was sent to Daraa, where there were protests every Friday. And he said he was given orders to go to Daraa with about 300 other soldiers. They were all sent without arms. This is March 2011, after the first protest had begun. And they only had batons. And he said they were there for 3 Fridays of protest. The protests were brutal, and it wasn't from the government. And this is Daraa 2011. He said the protesters came at them. Not every single protester, of course, was armed, but there were people amongst the protests that had weapons that immediately started firing on the unarmed Syrian soldiers and the unarmed Syrian police. And the first day, 10s were killed, and the next Friday, more were killed. They ran for their life, and they took security in the intelligence building in Daraa, and they begged for weapons. And from top down, from Damascus down, they said, no, we want to de-escalate. They thought that would de-escalate. Eventually, they had to retake Daraa. But this is all to say, what we were being told that from the beginning, the Syrian government was cracking down on peaceful protesters is nonsense. There are many examples of civilians that were murdered by mobs, by thugs. There was the example of a man from Banias, Nidal Janud, who was a farmer, and he was attacked by a mob, and he was slashed in his face, and he was paraded through town, and they were shouting slurs at him. They eventually slashed him to death. And he was just a farmer. He had even no political affiliation. I'm sure you've heard of people that worked for the government, for example, in the post office, or in some municipal capacity, that were slaughtered, thrown from the roof in Aleppo off a postal building, simply because they worked for the government. I have my own example from Madaya, where I was in June 2017, and I met a man who had been working at a municipality there, and he was thankfully not killed, but he was shot in the leg and badly injured simply because he continued to work at the municipality when terrorists occupied Madaya. And I will be getting into Madaya because that's one key element of propaganda on Syria. Much of what I want to look at is how the media has portrayed things, because I know you're all, I think, very well aware of what's happened in Syria, but I think it is important to hold the media accountable. And as either Joti or Ranjit said, it's important for independent voices to be able to share what we have seen. And what often happens if you start to get noticed, like I have to commend Vanessa Bailey. She has been the hardest working and most diligent investigative researcher to expose the white helmets. And she actually deserves a round of applause if you don't mind. But because she has pushed buttons, because she has exposed this entity for the imperialist propaganda machine that it is, they are attacking her relentlessly. They attack me for different reasons, but Vanessa, when they attack her, they're not attacking her arguments. They're trying to attack her character. And so they do that by various means, but none of them are legitimate, and it's all character smears. And it is relentless, and it's also physical threats, physical threats. But in any case, so to do this kind of work, the other thing they will say, and I will put this caveat out there just in case there is anybody who might believe it, it is said that we're on regime tours. First of all, it's the Syrian government. Second of all, we fight to go to Syria. It is not easy for either of us. Every time I go, I have to apply at the Syrian embassy, and I end up waiting for well over a month just to get my visa. Then I take a shared taxi into Damascus, and I pay for all my accommodation and transportation. And another thing I'd like to point out, since this is, for some people, a bit of a confusion or misconception, number one, you can actually interact one-on-one with people in Aleppo, in Damascus. The claim is made that you always have a regime minder with you, and that's not true. There are certain areas where, for your personal safety, like Aleppo, you have to have somebody with you, because in Aleppo there was always the risk of being kidnapped. Unlike Damascus, Aleppo did not have checkpoints throughout the city. So you never know if there's some sleeper cell or some individuals that have not been open about their affiliations. and they see somebody who might be very valuable and worth kidnapping. So I fully understand why in Aleppo it was more difficult to move independently. In Damascus, I move freely and I speak in my broken colloquial Arabic one-on-one with people. And so you can have these real interactions, but what the media tries to do is they say, well, number one, you're reporting from government, they say regime areas. So that's totally discounted because you always have a minder. That's not true. And they say we don't hear the other side. Well, my personal take on that is I don't want to hear the side of the Wahhabis. I don't value what they have to say. What I want to hear is, and I respect the Syrian authorities, and I will say that because it's not them that is the issue. There are internal issues of corruption, but that's not my issue to deal with. What I am trying to do is simply relay the voices of Syrians. And what was I going to say? So everywhere I've gone, that's been my objective. Sometimes I do write articles on the ambassador or certain Syrian leadership, but my focus has been almost entirely on Syrian civilians and what they've endured. And in government-secured areas, you can meet Syrians from the east of Syria. You can meet Syrians from before it was liberated, eastern Aleppo, who fled eastern Aleppo because of their terrorist presence. And they fled to a government-secured area and they started to rebuild their lives. And this is something that is completely omitted in the media because it's an inconvenient truth. There's at least 7 million internally displaced people or refugees. And since the media is always talking about refugees, well, let's consider the refugees within Syria. Where are they? They're by and large in government areas, being given housing by the government, being given food and medical care by the government and education. And they're rebuilding their lives until they can go home. And we know that after Aleppo was liberated, which the media said fell, since that point, at least 500,000 Syrians have gone home. And that's a huge number. And we don't hear about that. All we hear about is Syrians abroad who apparently hate Assad. That's not always true. I'm sure there are many who hate Assad for their own reasons. But I've met many Syrians in the months and months and months I spent in Lebanon waiting for my visa. I used to travel around Lebanon trying to find the cheapest place to stay because I'm actually not funded by Putin. And so I would stay in campgrounds, or I'd stay in a convent. I'd stay with friends in Lebanon, and I kept running into Syrians, and I kept having conversations with them. And they were from all over Syria. And only on 1 or 2 occasions did I meet a Syrian that was actually very openly anti-government, anti-Assad. And I met that Syrian in Beirut, in Hamra, which is a very trendy, expensive area of Beirut. But everywhere else I was meeting Syrians who were there either for work or to work to support their loved ones back in Syria. They wanted to go home and they hadn't left because of Assad. They left either because of the presence of these very violent, moderate rebels, or they left because of the economic situation, because sanctions on Syria, 7 years of war meant that many people are out of work, or if they're in an area that is it's a conflict area, their factory maybe has been destroyed or looted and taken to Turkey, like those in Aleppo. Many have left for that reason, but the media doesn't tell you that. They try to insinuate that, or insist rather, that all refugees outside of Syria have left because of the Syrian government, and that's not true. Some, yes, but not all. So I'd like to start, I want to give some examples from on the ground. One thing I'd like to start with is this, if you could possibly advance it to about 5 minutes, 31 seconds. Oh no, sorry, this video. Yeah, so this is a woman and her son. She's American, but she's been living in Syria for 20 years in Latakia, which is on the west coast of Syria. So will it play or? I'm terrible at Mac soaps. Oh, perfect. So now this has to do with media lies and the whole notion that, that nonviolent revolutions were occurring and protests were occurring. But in this instance, she talks about how the LA Times said all these things were happening in her city, and she was personally in all these areas. So you can hear what she has to say about that.
April the 1st of 2011 was the first day that I read a report online in the Los Angeles Times detailing a so-called peaceful protest in Latakia, which had turned violent. And I responded to the author of that article, found her on Facebook, and I discussed this with her because all of her details were wrong. She had lied throughout the whole report because I live here, and that day was a Friday. And I had been all over the town on various chores. So I had been in every spot shopping or visiting or doing something that she had reported on. And none of those details in her report were true. She admitted that she lived in Beirut, had never been to Latakia, and had heard these rumors. They had been told to her by others. The others, I must assume, they were opposition activists that knew where she lived in Beirut and knew she was a journalist for the Los Angeles Times, and they fed her this false information. So she published it. She then told me to contact her editor by email, and that she would love to have an private interview with me to get the true details. I wrote to her editor 5 times, never reply, and then I replied back to her. Again, never reply.
What publication was that?
Los Angeles Times.
So that whole interview, by the way, is quite interesting. They also talk about some of the massacres that occurred by people that were not yet formed into these various so-called rebel groups against Syrian civilians and Syrian security. You can find those if you're interested on my YouTube channel. Just Google my name, YouTube, and it should turn up, or go to my website and click on any of the YouTubes and sift through my channel if you're interested. I have another example. This is actually to do with Al Jazeera. In May 2011, a man named Ali Hashim resigned from Al Jazeera because he had video footage showing armed men entering from Lebanon into Syria, carrying guns and RPGs. And this was clearly showing at a time when the media was still saying unarmed revolution, popular uprising. This was clearly showing video evidence, militants entering Syria. And he said he'd actually seen it, but not been able to film it in April, the month prior. And he was told by, I don't know the name of his director or boss, he was told to ensi nofi musalahin, forget that you saw armed men. And so he resigned out of protest. And I know there's a number of other Al Jazeera employees that also resigned. And I think that's very significant. And the young man that I mentioned that was sent to Dara as a soldier, he said, now again, this is his word, take it for what you will, he said that he later saw, maybe in May or June, footage on Al Jazeera, again, showing Dara and saying this was now Dara, but it was in May or June. And he said, that footage was taken in March. I know, because I was there and I recognized the scene. So footage that was taken by somebody in the crowd was then recycled later on. I'd like to go to a place that was called the capital of the revolution. You might guess, I mean Homs. And in June 2014, so in April 2014, I went for my first time to Syria with a peace delegation. So there are 2 times of my 7 visits to Syria in which I didn't actually have to go to the embassy and apply. That was one. Another time is when I went with the amazing Cynthia McKinney, if you're aware of her. Yes, she's a wonderful, she used to be a US Congresswoman, but she was kicked out due to her very wonderful and honest policies with integrity. And she's very vocal on many important issues. Anyway, a small delegation with her, with Sarah Flounders of the International Action Center in the US, Ramsey Clark, who founded that center and was a former Attorney General, and some others. That's the second occasion where I didn't have to apply for the visa, just as an aside. So in April 2014, I went with a peace delegation, and then I went to Beirut, applied for my visa. While I was in Beirut waiting for my visa, the Syrian elections occurred. And so at that time, I decided to go to the Syrian embassy and see what was going on, and it was filled with Syrians wanting to vote. It was a very festive mood, more like a party than an election day. They had Syrian flags, some of them were wearing t-shirts with the Syrian president on them. But anyway, the important thing was they were there to choose their president. There was nobody forcing them to, because this is what the media was saying about elections in Lebanon. And the embassy was only supposed to be open from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. It stayed open to midnight, and it stayed open an additional second day, 7 a.m. to midnight. And on the note of elections, because this did come up last night in Derry, but I didn't have the chance to voice it because I was being shouted down. Syrians from around the world in countries like Canada, and I think the UK too has shut down the Syrian embassies. They flew to Damascus simply to vote because they wanted to participate in their elections. And the last point about the elections, because this is important, on election day in Syria, polling stations were shelled by these rebels that are bringing democracy to Syria. And people were killed. I don't have figures for you. It was well over 100 people, I believe, in Damascus alone, but you can check my blog, an article I wrote on that. So that's important because this shows these so-called rebels that are bringing democracy and freedom to Syria, the extent to which they will go to prevent actual democracy in Syria. In June 2014, I went to Homs. It had been secured in a deal similar to Aleppo 2016, a deal which saw these terrorists taken safely, given safe passage out of the city and taken to another area. And the thing is, the Syrian government made this compromise to ensure safety, at least in one area. They're waging strategic battles. They're fighting against terrorists, but they have to sometimes make concessions and then fight terrorist leaders. Unlike America, which just carpet bombed Raqqa, for example, destroyed the city. America has killed thousands of Syrians, or tens of thousands of Syrians and Iraqis. So the Syrian government actually enabled Homs to come to peace and security again by this deal. So a month after that, I met this family, the Ahras family, who had stayed in Old Homs. And their story contested what the media had told us. The media had said when there were military sieges on the so-called rebels in Homs, the Syrian government was starving the people. And what they had to say was, no, actually, they had food. The rebels, so-called rebels, had food, and they came to whoever was left in the old city, and they stole their food. They stole every last morsel of their food. So these are the revolutionaries that are helping the people. They're starving the people, and I'll give you some more examples later. But also in Homs, Also in Homs, I'm not sure if you've heard of the Dutch priest, Father Franz van der Loot. He was a priest that had been living in Syria for 5 decades, I believe it was. And in April 2014, April 7th, 2014, he was executed by one of these moderates. There's a photo of him on the right there with the glasses, and the man I'm talking to there was a friend of his, and so he was explaining how he arrived at the scene just after Father Franz was executed. But the interesting thing about Father Franz was that he was not a supporter of either the terrorist or the Syrian government, but what he did have to say was that from the beginning he saw armed people amongst the so-called nonviolent protest. And because he was sitting in the middle and not supporting either side, his words had a lot of impact. Thank you. In June 2014, I also went to a place called Malula, which you're probably aware of. It's an ancient Christian village of Syria. And here's an overview. You can just go there. So Malula was occupied from September 2013 off and on till April 2014. So 2 months after it was liberated of FSA, al-Nusra, and other terrorists, people started to come back and try to at least start working on the damage. And I was able to go there and speak with people. And then 2 years later, in the summer of 2016, I spoke with a woman named Antoinette. And while I was aware of what had happened in Malula and the great destruction, and in June 2014, I documented a lot of the destruction. She told me her own story, which was that she and her brother and other relatives and her father and aunt had been in their home in Malula, and they'd been hiding in a small cave, which was more of a storage area, when terrorists called for the men to come out. The men weren't armed, And when the three young men came out, the terrorists tried to force them to convert to their version of Islam. And I fully respect Islam, but these are Wahhabi mentalities. And these men said, I was born a Christian, I'm not converting. And so for that, they were executed. And she herself was still inside with her blind father and her aunt and a couple other relatives. And these militants shot inside. One of the bullets went through her chest. It was a critical injury, but she did survive. And they also threw a grenade into the room, which blasted her elbow off. So, I mean, this is just one of many, many stories of people. She's not a soldier. Her brothers were unarmed. Her brother was unarmed. And there are many stories like this in Malula and throughout Syria. But we're led to believe that these people are just moderate rebels. I'll fast forward. I want to address more the issue. One of the cards that has been played over and over and over again, I already referred to it with Homs, and that is that the Syrian government is starving people. And we heard that in Aleppo. And what we were told about Aleppo was that there were 250,000 or sometimes 300,000 people in East Aleppo who were starving because of the Syrian government's military siege on the terrorist factions in Aleppo. And we kept hearing that for pretty much all of 2016. And as I think you're aware, in December 2016, Aleppo was liberated. And those who wanted to remain and lay down their weapons were given that option. The foreign fighters and those who didn't want to give up their weapons were bussed out of there, given safe passage. And when journalists, including Vanessa Beeley, were able to talk with civilians from eastern Aleppo, what they heard was the terrorists were hoarding the food. The terrorists did not give us any food or medical care. And I heard that from some family that I interviewed in November 2016, just 1 month prior to the liberation. This family had tried twice to flee their area of eastern Aleppo, and they'd been prevented. And finally, when they did flee, they made it to the government area and government secured side, and they were given accommodation and all that. But what they said to me was the same thing. You know, we weren't given food, all the food that comes into that area, and there were aid shipments that were sent in. All that food was taken by these terrorists. In June 2017, I went to a place you might be familiar with. Do any of you recognize this photo? No, but we can't talk about Bana. No, this is actually a girl that, she was manipulated though, like Bana, but in a different sense. This is a girl from South Lebanon, but in January 2016, suddenly all the corporate media was talking about a village west of Damascus called Madaya. And they were showing many images of emaciated people in Madaya, and they were saying the Syrian government is starving people in Madaya. So one of the images that was used was this girl, and her parents actually found out that it had been lifted from their social media accounts. And they went on one of the Lebanese TVs and they said, this is our girl, she's alive and healthy, she doesn't live in Syria, let alone Madaya. Other images were used from prior campaigns in Syria and from around the world. So the whole thing with Madaya is media, just like Aleppo said, the government is starving people in Madaya. We have only one last doctor in Madaya, that kind of thing, the kind of things that we heard about Aleppo over and over again. But when I went there in June 2017, just like people who went to East Aleppo after liberation, what I heard was that, actually, you know what? I didn't include a photo. What I heard was the same thing, that there had been, I'm sorry, this is a bit out of, I do have one. Yeah. There had been food aid sent in, and in fact, this was documented by the Red Cross themselves. In October 2015, they had sent in truckloads of food and medical supplies into Madaya. And it was enough that it should have lasted for months. But suddenly, in January, some months later, everybody was starving Madaya, or at least many people were starving Madaya. That's what we were told. Around the same time, what media totally omitted was that in Foua and Kafraya, in Idlib, 2 villages in Idlib that didn't merit the attention of the media because it didn't support their narrative, those villages actually were starving because they'd been under full military siege since March 2015. And they still are suffering. They are completely surrounded by Jaish al-Fatah, including al-Nusra, al-Qaeda. and on a daily basis they're bombarded, they're shelled, they're sniped, and they're denied access to food and medical care. But the media didn't think this was relevant, and if they did even mention these villages, they just say 2 Shia villages, as if somehow Shias aren't worthy of mention. It's completely sectarian, it's completely against how Syrians used to live. And incidentally, I have a friend from Kafraya, and he told me before all this, even though the village is predominantly Shia, we intermarried and we shared one another's holidays and faiths. And this is the way it was throughout Syria. I've had people tell me this over and over again. But Fuan Kafraya didn't merit mention. This photo, you can see a box. It's the remnants of a Red Cross food aid parcel. And I saw it sitting right outside of a bomb factory. So all we heard about Madaya was starving civilians. We didn't hear about the 600 terrorists, roughly 600 terrorists within Ahrar al-Sham, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorists, and that they were hoarding food. And above this munitions factory was at least one of the storage areas where they were storing the food. So when I saw this box sitting right next to their munitions factory, it was so symbolic of what was really happening in Madaya and what we never heard. Excuse me. I did have videos to show you, but because of the computer issue, I can't show you. But however, again, you can go to my blog. There's a lot of photos and videos from Madaya. And another area I went to this past June called Al-War. Al-War is west of Homs. It was an area that was it's called Homs al-Jadid, or New Homs. And it's a lovely area of wide boulevards. And people of different faiths lived there. It was kind of, as Homs had expanded, people had moved to this new neighborhood. It was one of the areas that was later occupied as militants or terrorists were sent out of the old city and other areas of Homs. And Al-War, although it didn't get the same amount of media propaganda and attention as Aleppo and Madaya, Al-War, they also did say that the Syrian government was starving people in Al-War. And again, when I went there and spoke with people, it was the other situation, that there had been food entering and the terrorists were keeping control of all the food. In December 2015, I actually was at the entrance to Al-War, standing at a military checkpoint, roughly 100 meters from the FSA or whichever faction checkpoint it was down the road. And I saw civilians actually coming and going from the district. So the government was enforcing a siege on the militants, but civilians were able to come and go. They were checked on either side by the government and by the militants. But there was a bread factory there too, which was providing the bread that went into Al-War. And I had people tell me from Homs that in Al-War they still had water and electricity, and they weren't paying for it because, well, the factions there wouldn't allow people to pay, and the people couldn't pay for it. They're desperately poor. But all that to say, services were being provided and food was being sent in, yet somehow people were still starving, and you know the reason why. In June 2017, also, I went back to Aleppo. Now, maybe I should just fast forward or rewind back a little bit, because Aleppo was subject to so much propaganda. In addition to starvation, in much of 2016, we kept hearing about hospitals being bombed. And I'll address at least 2 instances. One that the media largely did not talk about, and that was this maternity hospital, which was bombed in May of 2016, killing 3 women. You would think that would be somewhat notable since it's a maternity hospital. And it was a private hospital, and I spoke with the director, and he told me that a week after it was internally destroyed, a mortar or some sort of explosive fired from the areas inhabited by the terrorist factions landed on the roof, injuring construction workers that were working on the roof to repair. So that was only one example. A more notable example of a hospital destroyed was the Al-Kindi hospital, which was the best cancer research and treatment hospital in the region. And it was truck or tunnel bombed by Al-Nusra in, I believe, 2012. And I actually, in November 2016, met the former director of Kindi, and he had something interesting to say. He said he reached out to various international NGOs and implored them to do something, to say something. This is before Kindi was destroyed. This is only when Kindi was occupied. And he said he was met with silence. And he said after the destruction of Kindi, he was met with silence. And of course, in a just world, all these voices that were crying about alleged bombings of hospitals in eastern Aleppo would have shown some concern for the Dabit hospital or Kindi, but they were met with silence. When I went to Aleppo for my first time in July 2016, because of all these reports of last doctors we were already hearing, and we heard throughout pretty much all of 2016, I went to the Aleppo Medical Association, and I met with the head of the Aleppo Medical Association, Dr. Eva Bartlett, and he told me, actually, Aleppo has 4,160 doctors. And when we were hearing about last specialists, he said of those doctors, 800 are specialists, including pediatricians, etc. And I have now, he's a personal friend now, I didn't know him before, but Dr. Nabil Antaki is a gastroenterologist, and he's in Aleppo. And he's actually an amazing person because in addition to his prime job, which his paying job, he's a volunteer to help severely wounded people and give them extra care. And there's a small group of doctors that are doing this for Syrians to do what they can to help one another, even though they're not being paid for it. But all that to say that there were doctors in Aleppo, but what we were hearing always about Aleppo was solely referring to the areas in the east occupied by terrorist factions. So 1.5 million people in greater Aleppo were disappeared by our corporate media because it didn't fit their narrative. I'd like to play this clip. Now, I don't know if you recognize the man on the left.
Yes,
Channel 4 News. Now, Channel 4 News, if you're aware, has been one of the largest purveyors of war propaganda, to the extent they even embedded with Noradin al-Zinki terrorist, which had beheaded a 12-year-old Palestinian child, Abdullah Isa. And they continually whitewashed the acts of terrorists. And this man, Krishnan Gurumurthy, who I actually shared an elevator with without knowing who he was. Had I known, I don't know what I would have done. But he was one of the relentless liars. And this is a video I took from a longer report he did after Aleppo was liberated, and he went back to Aleppo. And the man he's talking to is Faraz Shahabi, who is a Syrian MP based in Aleppo. He's also head of the Chamber of Industry in Aleppo. And I thought their conversation was interesting. I did cut it just to show the most interesting parts, but do watch his body language.
So you're saying the Americans should hand it over to the Russian-backed Syrian forces, effectively?
Well, it's not they should or they shouldn't. This is international law. The American or any NATO presence in Syria is illegal. So basically, Raqqa or any other city where they are should be handed over to the Syrian government. This is the legitimate Syrian government. And one more thing, this is, you said earlier, this here wasn't rebel held. This was Nusra held territory, where we at now.
You have got most of your city back.
Yeah.
But many of the people who you said were your people have left. They've gone with the rebel forces to Idlib.
Actually,
so how can you ever restore the full balance of this city?
Actually, most of the people from the eastern parts of Aleppo are around you now. They are here. A lot of these Nusra fighters were killed. 5,000 civilians that are Islamic Brotherhood, minded, went with them. The remaining people from eastern Aleppo were able to come back. Actually, 90,000 people just last month came back.
Whatever happens in the rest of the country as you're taking more territory, and there's no doubt you are, the West, Washington and London, still wants there to be a reckoning with President Assad. They still say he can't be part of the future long term.
Well, it's not what they say. We don't care really what they say.
You just don't care.
No, we just don't care. It's what we say. We want anyone who wants to rule our country has to go through the ballot boxes. We have a parliament, we have a constitution. It's not any country in NATO that can appoint our presidents. We choose our president.
But how can you restore Syria to some sort of international balance when half the world thinks its president is a war criminal?
Well, first of all, half the world or quarter of the world, it is when they stop meddling with our affairs and stop supporting terror groups. They've been calling the Nusra moderate rebels. Look at. I just remind you of the Channel 4, which they owed us an apology.
Well, let's not get into history.
Listen. No. In December, the coverage was moderate rebels fighting the Assad regime forces. It turned out that these moderate forces were Nusra. They are now in Idlib. It turned out that the majority, 1 million people of Eastern Aleppo, are coming back to Eastern Aleppo. It turned out that we unified the city, and the first time in 6 years we can stand here in front of the city.
Faraz Shahabi, we're not going to reopen that old argument.
when Aleppo was liberated, the family remained. And the father, according to his testimony, and I have no reason to doubt it, the father said the terrorists coerced him to tell their story. They tried to bribe him. An ambulance, and that's perhaps drawers used to. No, but it's a good question because it literally could be that staged.
This is what I'm trying to say.
You're right, because in
to me, it's clearly a filing cabinet.
well, in December I believe it was December 2016 in Egypt, some filmmakers were arrested staging a video of children in Aleppo. I have it on my blog, but just Google Egypt filmmakers Aleppo arrested, and there have been many, many incidents of manipulated videos or staged videos, and I want to play one now from 2014. But the importance of this one is that the BBC had an expert to analyze this, to give her opinion. This is a BBC expert. BBC is shaping world opinion.
VLC.
الله اكبر الله اكبر الله اكبر الله اكبر هرب هرب
يا شباب لك شفت شلون اطلقوا النار عليه؟
شايفين الكلاب
حيوانات والله كلاب.
شايف شيء
يا شباب
شايفين شيء
رجعوا لورا
ديروا
اكبر
بالكم
رجعوا ورا. لا حول ولا قوة الا بالله.
شباب شباب عم يتحرك
لا لا
عم يتحرك
لك هذا حي والله مو ميت.
هيا بيتحرك الله اكبر الله اكبر الله اكبر.
There was a video that was trending in 2014, I think it was. It was called Syria Hero Boy. You might have heard of it. It shows a boy running into what looks like crossfire, rescuing a little girl, running away, and the world was like, oh my God, you know, these boys are being fired on by the regime. And so it was trending. So BBC Trending had their expert Amira Galal on and there was some debate. She's like, well, there's some debate as to the validity of this video, but I shouldn't do a British accent here. In any case, she said, you know, we don't know for sure if the video is 100% accurate or something like that, but we know for sure it's in the Syrian regime. Whenever I say regime, I have to do this because I call it government, because it is a government. We know for sure it's in the regime area, because in the video you can see barrels painted with the Syrian army flag. She actually said Syrian army flag, not the flag of the country Syria. And so this expert declared it had to be a Syrian government area because these barrels were painted with the Syrian army flag. Guess what? Next photo, please. I'm sure you all know what a Syrian flag looks like. So it just astounded me that she could say that. Did you notice the inversion of colors? So first of all, it's the flag of Syria, not the army. I'm surprised she didn't say Assad's forces, frankly. But here's the real barrel, and it turned out, the real flag, and this is on Castella Road in Aleppo, and I took this photo there, but it turned out the video was made in Malta. So it wasn't even in Syria, but this expert was so sure. So this is just an example to make you think. I mean, I don't think this audience needs that, but an example of how much the media just is completely full of shit many times. They don't know what they're talking about. Yeah. There was a video of a woman, a very honest journalist, saying, we are parachute journalists. We parachute into conflicts. We don't know what we're talking about. We take the lead from Reuters and we fill in the blanks, but we don't know what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And I think, and she was being very honest. She was Swedish or something. And I'm sure that's, if they're not intentionally lying, like the Anne Barnards of New York Times, then they're just they're reading from Reuters and they're just going with the script. Meanwhile, those of us who actually go and talk with people are somehow stooges. Okay, there's one glaring example I'd like to get to, although I think you're all pretty aware of the white helmets. Oh yes. Does anybody need any background on the white helmets, or is it pretty crystal clear? So white helmets, packaged as neutral independent rescuers, are actually hideously funded, insanely funded. What's that? No, it's okay, I'll just skip it then. So they're a propaganda construct, and somehow they're still very effective. Well, I know why somehow, because they have been so greatly funded They were awarded an Oscar or something.
Best fiction.
Pardon me?
Best fiction.
Yeah, and now there's more media about them. And again, what we were saying at the beginning about vilification of journalists to expose, because Vanessa Beeley has been so instrumental in exposing this fraudulent group, she is being the most hardly attacked by the media and other entities. But the white helmets were, the interesting thing is this Guardian piece that I think maybe Joti referred to. So it's interesting that they chose somebody who knew seemingly nothing about Syria. Her expertise was glamour and tech, and she's based in California, to write this smear piece. And in it, she did not even address a single one of the concerns about the White Helmets funding, the White Helmets holding weapons, the White Helmets participating in executions, the White Helmets cheering with Al-Qaeda, and the many, many other serious questions about the White Helmets. Instead, she just went through the usual smear campaign tactics of conspiracy theorist, regime tour kind of thing. But it is interesting that they chose her, and also she, of course, inserted this Russia-phobic kind of slant. It's trying to claim that any investigations into the White Helmets were due to Russia. And while I fully respect Russia's role in Syria, because it was welcomed by the Syrian government to fight terrorism, and that's exactly what it's been doing. And I mean, the Syrian Arab Army, and I meant to say this at the beginning because you had said something. I meant to say, Syria, I believe, and I'm so thankful it's not, Syria could have possibly been like Libya if it were not for the Syrian Arab Army, Hezbollah, Russia, and all its allies, and the Syrian people. And the Syrian people are incredibly resilient. There are many Syrian local defense forces, including, for example, in Malula. Yes, Hezbollah, yes, Syrian Arab Army in Malula, but also local defense forces fighting for their lives, fighting for their futures. And these people, their voices, their struggles are totally removed by the corporate media because it doesn't fit their narrative. So we've addressed most of the content I wanted to, and especially thanks already to Joti and Ranjit. But I wanted to say one of the other ruses the corporate media and the fake human rights groups and fake Western leadership or imperialist leadership have used is to say again and again and again that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons on its people. In Khan al-Assal in 2012, it was later shown that it was the so-called rebels that had access to chemical weapons, and not the Syrian army that had done it. In 2013, the Ghouta accusations were completely illogical. They've painted the president of Syria into being a monster. We understand that. A villain, we understand that. And also stupid, because at the time of Ghouta, there were UN inspectors visiting Syria. And at that time, he's so dumb that he orders a chemical weapons incident to happen again. Of course, I'm being sarcastic. And there was the most notably the latest one in Han Sheikhoun, in which they sent people to gather, to do tests wearing flip-flops and preventive clothing like flip-flops to gather sarin samples, and in which Trump did not wait for an investigation before bombing, in which they haven't actually sent an investigative team there. They relied on testimonies taken in Turkey, and they actually, the OPCW Joint Investigative Mechanism report, had testimonies of people who were entered into hospital prior to the incident actually happening. This is their rock-solid evidence. Yet, America has used chemical weapons on people. Israel has used chemical weapons on people, on civilians. I was in Gaza when Israel rained down white phosphorus throughout Gaza, and I have documentation of civilians murdered or maimed by white phosphorus, and not just in one location. Yet no one has held them accountable. And these same nations that have committed these war crimes again and again are accusing Syria of using chemical weapons. It's just beyond imagination. It's so hypocritical. I want to wrap up by saying I did want to address North Korea, but only in brief, because I know you already know what's going on with North Korea. I have to imagine most of you know the history the US genocide of North Korea in the 50s, the constant nuclear threats, the constant threat to their existence and the lives of 25 million people. And yet North Korea is being lauded as the threat to humanity. And it's not North Korea that has used the nuclear bomb, it's America. I was in North Korea for a week in August this past year. I won't go into too much detail, you can find it on my blog. It was only 1 week. You can say it was a guided trip, I admit that. You don't have a whole lot of access, but I respect the will of the government, and they have every reason to control access. If they have been exterminated, if they've been faced with extermination, why should they trust any of us? Why should they trust me? They have no reason to pander for our acceptance. We should be pandering for their acceptance. We should be pandering for their forgiveness. But I was with Tim Anderson and Carla Ortiz, the Bolivian actress, and we did have a chance to have many human interactions, even though we weren't always alone, and I don't speak Korean, but we went to public places, a zoo, amusement park, we went to schools, we went to a children's hospital, we went to down to the demilitarized zone area, learned more of that history. Interestingly, in the hall, and you're probably already aware of this, but saw photos of in 2000 and 2007 when North and South leaders were meeting and having peace talks, trying to have peace talks. And always it is stymied by the US and other imperialist nations. Even now, I have to say, while traveling, I can't follow the news, but I think I saw something on Twitter saying that the Olympic team that was formed between North and South, it might have been disbanded. I'm not 100% sure, but I feared this would happen. This was a genuine gesture towards peace and reunification. What I heard in North Korea, the primary message was people want reunification. Yes, I asked, well, how's that going to work? Like, you have a socialist system in the North and a capitalist system in the South. And I don't know if the answer I got was realistic, but they said we would find a means in which we would be one unified country with the two systems. And perhaps there's people here that can articulate that better, but the point was the foremost thing they want is to reunify and peace. And they've been working for peace, and they've been asking for their armistice treaty to become a peace treaty since the 50s. And Michel Chossudovsky, who's a Canadian professor, was doing a speaking tour a month or so ago. And when he spoke in Hamilton, he spoke very interestingly about the arms race and how it was America that was the reason for the nuclear arms development race, and how they had this plan to bomb their allies when they were allies, Russia when they were allies, Manhattan Project, right? In any case, it was America that brought nukes to the Korean Peninsula first. And the only reason North Korea is pursuing any sort of nuclear deterrent is to prevent their destruction again. And they have the right to have a self-deterrence. We can't trust America or any imperialist nation to be benevolent or to hold their word. And that's all North Korea has been doing. They're not the ones that are threatening to destroy entire nations. They're only saying we're going to defend ourselves. And the people I met with, the children, high school children, were incredibly well informed, very, just lovely children, but they said, you know, we're not afraid of war, we're ready to defend ourselves. No kid, no child should have to deal with that. But on an annual basis, at least 2 times a year, the US and its allies perform what they call war drills, where they simulate the destruction of North Korea again. And if you're living there in the North, how do you know if this is actually going to be the time that they get sent back to the 50s? So the war rhetoric it's really insane, not just from America, from Canada as well. And I'm so glad, again, with reference to what Ranjit and Joti said, this seems to be an amazing group. You're so informed. I wish that we had groups like this in Canada. We're all here tonight for the same reasons, because we care about people in these countries that are being targeted by imperialist nations. we're all doing what we can. And we're fighting for people who, due to the imbalance in the world, they might be across the world and they have no say in what warmongers in offices in Washington are deciding about their future. So we're fighting to change that. There is one interesting initiative in the States, and that's a coalition to shut down the U.S. foreign bases. I applaud that initiative. I hope it becomes a reality, but I think it's a really uphill battle for them. But it's important that they're speaking out about this. That's the first step. I don't have an inspiring message to end with because I feel like this audience already knows. I don't need to tell you to share and to educate because you probably can educate me. But I would like to thank you for listening to what I have to say. I have a lot more I could say on Syria and on Palestine too. My heart is with Palestine, the oppressed people there. And with every time one of these nations is targeted, in the background, Palestinians are still being genocided and Israel is still thieving more land. So full solidarity to Palestinians in their struggle and their armed resistance. And to all the resistance.
We're inspired when we see your bravery, your courage, your ability to go to war zones without fear for your own safety in order to bring us the truth. And we're inspired when we see, we didn't bring this audience here, The audience came to see you. We're very glad that they came to see you. I'm inspired to see that you have the courage, once you see the way imperialism acts, to challenge some of the bigger lies that are very unsexy to challenge. And particularly, I'm not going to give a speech on North Korea. I've done that before. I've been to North Korea as well, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And I could speak about it at great lengths because it's a beautiful place. It's a place that's free from the overwhelming Western drive towards consumerism, commercialism, advertising everywhere. It's a place where you go and you feel like you actually breathe the fresh air of liberty. It's a very strange thing to say. It's so at odds with the propaganda, but that's how it feels to be there. And when you go there, it's amazing how the people are brave and courageous. When actually, these war exercises that Eva mentioned, they mobilize 1 million people. 1 million people, 1 million troops are mobilized from the South Korean army and the United States force. And the United States remain in occupation of South Korea. They remain in command of the South Korean army. They're the supreme command of the South Korean army. They've never signed a peace treaty, having killed 4 million in Korea. And they've continued in a state of perpetual war with those people. And there's a lesson about standing up to imperialism that the Koreans learn, that we all need to learn and that people can learn from Korea, which is why they're so desperate to isolate us from places like that as being insane and crazy. They're nothing like us. We can learn anything from them. Because they've learned that you stand up, you meet unreason with unreason. If Donald Trump says, we'll send you fire and fury like you've never seen before, they say, well, we'll detonate a nuclear bomb. We only have a very tiny number of nuclear bombs, but we're not going to lie down to you. And what did Madeleine Albright say? She said, we invaded Iraq because they had no weapons of mass destruction. We didn't invade North Korea because they had weapons of mass destruction. And perhaps that's the message we should end on, that actually imperialism, in the words of Mao Zedong, is a paper tiger. That actually these 5 people who exercise the armies, these 5 billionaires, these few billionaires who exercise and control the armies and control the media, their war propaganda is an instrumental part of their war. Actually, as they go to regions in Syria in order to stir up trouble and foment instability, they stop buses and they murder the people on the buses. As the news is coming with them, as they're entering areas, they then spread the lies that it was Assad's government who shot the people on the buses and they're coming to defend them. So they commit the crimes, they televise the crimes, they broadcast the crimes, they blame them on their enemy and use this as their justification to create even greater crimes. And if they do it, they're a little microcosm actually. They've learned all their techniques from the main criminals, who are the imperialist criminals. This is precisely how they behave. So it's been amazingly inspiring to hear Eva's direct, first-hand testimony, unchallengeable testimony, as you can see, because the truth ultimately, again in the words of Mao, is stronger than atom bombs. And it's a tremendous, when the vast masses of the people ultimately are capable of standing up and opposing this tiny clique of gangsters. But what it's clear is that these are not just accidents. This consistent barrage of propaganda and misinformation is just that. It is war propaganda. It's deliberate. It's the same billionaires who own the media, who own the weapons companies, who own actually have monopoly on the means of production of entire humanity. And if they broadcast this propaganda, because it helps to reinforce their rule as well as just being good business. So it's not an accident, it's a direct assault upon your liberty, your freedom, your right to have control of your own wealth and to have control of your own destiny. And I guess the final message that I want to end with before I want to throw the floor open for your questions to Eva while you have the privilege of speaking to and addressing your questions directly, is to say that if we're to have an effective anti-war movement, it's quite clear that you don't simply wish for peace and say that guns are bad things. They are bad things. But you have to direct your activity against those who make the wars. And they're not accidents, they're not peaceful revolutions. There is an entire system of war enforced upon the world in order to enforce the rule of this tiny clique of people. And that impinges upon all of us, even in the heart of imperialism, even in the belly of the beast. So we need to think very carefully about how we can found a movement which is a genuinely anti-imperialist war movement, not just a pious, wish for better times, but there's nothing we can do, wash our hands of the whole affair. We are living in the country which is one of the chief criminals. The people who, just a mile over this way, southeast, in the city of London, from their stock exchange, they have their own police, they have their own cordon, they can shut down that whole area of the city, stop us from going in and out of it. They control our government in a much more direct way than you and I do when we vote in elections. It's high time we realise that, it's high time we put that at the centre of our politics, it's high time we founded a movement that seeks to bring the truth to the working people of Britain. Not to try and enlighten MPs who know full well what it is that they're doing, who signed an early day motion to condemn some individual act, like it's an accident. It's not an accident. It's a deliberate, concerted campaign. It is what imperialism is. And if we don't challenge that, then we really are helpless. And it's that sense of apathy and helplessness that spreads because precisely all of these movements that we're offered are meaningless, are ineffective. There are many effective. The effective imperialism aims its propaganda constantly at the working people because they're massive people. And at the end of the day, they have power collectively. But if they're individualized, if they're isolated, if they're broken down, if they don't realize who their enemies are, then they are powerless. So it's our job to end that. And I think Joti's speech that she gave, talking about how we can found a genuinely anti-imperialist movement, is the lesson we have to take. I'd invite you all to share your contact details. Paul will be able to give you some paper and pen. Please give them to us. We'd love your email, we'd love your phone number to keep in touch with you about future events and carry on building this momentum, because this is really what a proper Stop the War movement worthy of the name should be doing.